We're going to be looking at solve by taking the square root. So we have 5 different methods to solve a quadratic. The first one is graphing, and then we're going to be looking at the next 4 over the next couple weeks, which are solving by taking the square root, completing the square, quadratic formula, and factoring, which we've already looked at. So when we're solving, we're essentially finding the x-intercepts of the graph, or where the graph crosses the x-axis. So solve by taking the square root. We are going to try and isolate x, and then one of the last steps you have to do is square root to undo the operation of something being squared. So you're going to treat this like a normal equation. So the first thing that we're going to do is add 5 to both sides. Because remember, we're trying to isolate the x. So we get 4 squared equals 7. And then from there, we're going to divide by 4. And we get x squared equals 7 over 4. And now we're at the phase of how do we undo something being squared? Well, we square root it. So we're going to square root both sides. So we get x equals, now this is going to be new for some of us. So when we take the square root of something, technically whatever that x is could be plus or minus. So for example, if I do 5 squared, I get 25. But if I do negative 5 squared, I get 25. So we have to now, when we're solving for x, get in the habit of doing plus or minus for your answer. So we have plus or minus. I'm going to go ahead and separate that and make it the square root of 7 over the square root of 4. And then we know that we cannot have radicals in the denominator, but luckily the square root of 4 simplifies. So our final answer will be plus or minus the square root of 7 over 2, because the square root of 4 is 2. All right, looking at the next one. So we are going to add 8 to both sides. And we get 2x squared equals 8. And then to isolate that x, we want to undo the multiplication of 2 by dividing. So we get x squared equals 4. And that last step is to square root both sides to undo something being squared. So we get x equals plus or minus. Now the square root of 4 is a perfect square. So the answer is just plus or minus 2. Because 2 squared is 4 and negative 2 squared is 4. So what this means is if we were to graph this equation, the x-intercepts would be at positive 2 and negative 2 on the x-axis. Okay, so a few more here. We are going to subtract 6 first. And we get 3x squared equals 27. Then we want to undo multiplying by 3 by dividing it. So we get x squared equals 9. And the last step is to square root. So we get x equals, remember, the plus or minus. And then the square root of 9. 9 is a perfect square, and so it is 3. So the new thing that you have to remember is that plus or minus. So on this one, we are going to add 9 to both sides. So we get 5x squared equals 11. Then we want to undo that multiplication of 5 by dividing. So we get x squared equals 11 over 5. And the last step would be to square root. So we get x equals plus or minus root 11 over root 5. So this was kind of like number 1, where we had a square root over a square root. But number 1, we were able to take the square root of 4, which was just 2. And this one, we can't take the square root of 5 because it's not a perfect square. We would get a decimal. So we have to actually rationalize the denominator by multiplying by root 5 over root 5. So we would end up getting x equals plus or minus root 55 over 5. And this one, if you were to branch root 55, we would end up just getting 11 and 5, so it can't be broken down anymore. All right, this problem looks a little bit different. The first step right away is we have to get rid of that squared. So the first step in this problem is actually to square root it. So if you undo, to undo the squared, you square root it, and we end up getting x plus 5 equals plus or minus, and then the square root of 36 is 6. And so then we are going to subtract 5, and we get kind of a weird looking answer, plus or minus 6 minus 5. So if you can, you want to simplify this. And what I mean by if you can is these are like terms, so we are able to keep going. So think of this as if you have a positive 6 minus 5, you get 1. But if you have a negative 6 minus 5, you get negative 11. So you have, once again, all of these have two answers. So the plus or minus 3 is like x equals 3, x equals negative 3. So all of them have two answers so far. All right, this one just has a first initial step of we need to divide by 4. So we get x plus 10 squared equals 6. And then now this kind of looks like the previous one. So we are going to go ahead and square root it. And we get x plus 10 equals that automatic plus or minus the square root of 6. And the last step we do is subtract 10. So we get x equals plus or minus the square root of 6 minus 10. Now in this one, we're actually done because we can't really combine the square root of 6 minus 10, so we just leave it. But keep in mind that's two answers. It's root 6 minus 10 and negative root 6 minus 10. So this is solving by taking the square root.